Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show, Science Dispatch Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Cameron English, joined again by my faithful, dedicated co-hosts, Dr. Barbara Billauer, Dr. Chuck Dinnerstein, Director of Medicine at the American Council on Science and Health. My friends, how are you this lovely day?
Vertical and happy.
I'm good too.
Well, look at that. We have a consensus. Everyone's in a good mood. We're ready to talk about some science. We have two stories, as we always do. The first one is by our colleague, Dr. Henry Miller. It's called Good News About This Season's Flu Vaccines. And then we're going to wrap it up with an educational and entertaining story by Dr. Josh Bloom called Sudafed PE is Worthless, just like the drug policies that put it on the shelf. Josh subtle as always, so we'll get to that in a second. But let's talk about this season's flu vaccines, which seem to be working reasonably well, I think. So Henry begins a story. He says, the process of selecting viruses for the yearly flu vaccine is complex and inexact. For the 23-24 flu season, there is reason to be optimistic that the vaccines will provide good protection. So, Chuck, I'm willing to bet a lot of our listeners understand the broad outlines of how this process works. But I think the specifics are probably unclear to at least some people. So can you give us just a brief rundown of how this process works?
So first thing I learned is that when I actually started reading about it a few years ago, once again, I discovered how parochial I was, despite the fact that I live in the tri-state area of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And what I mean by that is that first fact is that flu is a global disease, no surprise there, and it migrates throughout the year. It is a disease of the fall and winter, which occurs at the opposite end of the year in the southern hemisphere than the northern hemisphere. And we make use of that information in order to develop vaccines for the upcoming year. So it's a little bit of a crapshoot, but that's how it goes. What we do is we do surveillance on the influenza species that are going around in the southern hemisphere during our spring and summer. And after discussion with the World Health Organization's surveillance system, we define what will be the types that we go after in the northern hemisphere in the upcoming year. And those are the ones that we direct our vaccines to.
So again, as people are probably aware, there's a wide variance when it comes to the efficacy of these shots. I mean, I've seen estimates, depending on the year, anywhere from like 12% to like 60%. And it's usually somewhere in between there, like maybe 40, 50% is usually what you can count on. I guess we should put that in perspective. That's still pretty darn good. You know, like if you can cut your risk of getting the flu in half by getting a shot, I mean, I like that deal. And that's why I get it every year, you know, and it doesn't always work, which again, we're trying to stress here, but it still seems important to me that people get this. And then Henry cites some statistics. There was one study, I think it was by the CDC. It said it cut the risk of hospitalization by 52%. So that's a really big deal. What are your thoughts from either of you on that?
It's interesting because I think, I always hate to do this, but if we put it into the context of COVID, there's a lot of good lessons in there. First of all, when we talk about it's effective, the influenza vaccine is very effective in preventing the disease and lessening the disease. And you rarely hear us have debates about it where they're fighting about the number of people hospitalized or the number of people dying, which are also reduced by the vaccine. But I think that the emphasis with the influenza vaccine has been for a long time. When we say efficacy, we're talking about not getting sick. And so I think that's a little bit different than some of the fighting back and forth when we talk about the COVID vaccines, where, you know, people will draw the line. It doesn't influence hospitalizations or it doesn't influence mortality.
I think we also have to consider that every hospitalization that we prevent allows more resources to be available for additional challenges we're now facing because of the times. We're talking about COVID, which we hadn't seen before. We're talking about RSV, which we hadn't seen in these numbers before. And so one victory, or one even partial victory, allows more resources available for other people who are sick with other diseases.
I think that's a good point. I mean, they get kind of back to the idea of flattening the curve. And the more people we can keep out of the hospital, clearly it is the better situation. And certainly, even from an economic point of view, being hospitalized with any of these diseases is far more costly than not having them at all, or having a mild case where you're home from work for a day or two.
Just a more general question before we move on. Why is it that we have a seasonal flu? And I've heard multiple explanations over the years. One is that, the cold weather has some sort of effect on our collective immune systems and makes it more likely that we're going to get sick. Because the viruses, my understanding is they never go away. They're always circulating somewhere in the world and mutating. But for one reason or another, it's in the fall and winter that they become especially nasty in terms of, giving us the sniffles, or, worse in some cases. So do you have any insight into that?
Well, again, and a lot of this comes from all the research and education around the pandemic. While the viruses can be present throughout the year, climate has a definite effect upon them. They do not like the cold. They like humid. So there's that on their behalf. And they definitely like warm. Mm-hmm. So as we move indoors in the winter, that's an increase. We have an increased viability of the viral particles. Also, as we move indoors in the winter, we tend to be more crowded with one another. Our local personal population density goes up. We're not spending as much time necessarily outside. And I think all those type of things contribute to the increased strength of the virus. And then you very well may be right. There may be some underlying circadian rhythm to our immune system. There's certainly circadian rhythms to most of our physiology that makes us a little bit more vulnerable in the winter.
And also, a lot of these viruses are spread by children. And in the summertime, of course, children are outside, as Chuck was saying. They're not in school infecting each other. So not just this vaccine, measles also, the spread by children is a prime driver of these diseases. And of course, now that school starts, you increase the locus for transmission.
See, that's a great point, because if you think back to polio, that was a summer disease, because the source of that was the water, and that's when the kids were playing in the water. So that's a great point, that how humans move through our built environment also has an impact on our susceptibility.
So it's an eco-nation. We're living not just independently of what's going on around us. It's our relationship with the organisms that surround us.
Absolutely. You're singing my song.
Henry doesn't mention this in his story, but I would like to get both your thoughts on this too, is that there are efforts underway to develop mRNA flu vaccines that are based on more or less the same platform that some of the COVID shots are based on. Again, these have not been developed, but they seem to be coming down the pipe reasonably quickly, and there seems to be some benefits. So for one thing, it targets a different part of the flu virus that doesn't mutate nearly as frequently, which means it might be more effective year over year. And I think there's another possibility that you can actually target, as a result of that, more strains of the flu. So that seems like a big deal. Do either of you have any insight into what's going on there, or if that would be good for public health, or if it might not have any effect at all?
I think that the the advent of the mRNA vaccines allow a level of targeting that we've not had before. It's more strategic. The earliest vaccine efforts were just some version of promoting natural immunity when you think about Jenner and inoculations. And over time, you get up to the period of polio, and we're talking about inactivated viruses versus attenuated viruses. And now we're far more strategic. We are looking at the cellular walls of these organisms or other qualities that they have to go after them. And I think that a strategic approach certainly has advantages, but sometimes that strategic advantage doesn't necessarily work to our interest because, as Barbara said, these organisms are co-evolving with us. And if we place all of our eggs in the basket of treating the spike and the mutation occurs somewhere else and makes it more viable, we don't have an immune response to it. So I think that, as with anything, this targeted approach certainly has some advantages because it cuts down on cross reactions with other immune elements, but it still may have some limitations. I don't think that we're going to find the universal vaccine. I think we're going to find a vaccine that's more effective at baseline.
And to follow up on what Chuck was saying, we see this in the monovalent versus bivalent COVID boosters. The bivalent vaccine might have a broader spectrum, but it's not as robust. And so when we focus on precisely the immune mechanisms involved, which is not available on a broad spectrum vaccine, we're getting less of a response.
Yeah, it's a tough issue when it comes to infectious diseases and stopping them. The idea I had in mind, this is from an article I wrote in 2021. There's another vaccine expert that I go to often named Dr. Ben Loughlin. And I think he advises his state government on flu vaccines and so forth. But he points out that you can, instead of like a tri or quadrivalent vaccine, you could develop a decavalent vaccine that protects against, I don't know, maybe 10 strains or even more. Or I think it's called the hemagglutinin stock part of the virus. So if you can target all of these or that central part, you may have more effect. I mean, who knows, right? It hasn't happened yet, but it seems like that would be promising. And of course, you could develop them, as Barbara was sort of alluding to just a second ago. You can develop them much quicker, because you develop one and it does what it's supposed to temporarily, but then it needs to be updated and so forth. So I don't know. It seems like it might be encouraging at the minimum.
Well, it certainly sounds like it would be something that would be useful as a first aid mechanism or the shot of first response until we have time to work on more precise vaccine maneuvers. So my guess is eventually we'll probably have an arsenal of both, of broad spectrum and more targeted or more focused vaccines.
I think overall one of the great lessons of the pandemic is how little we understand the immune system compared to what we thought we knew. There's a lot of, going back to Don Rumsfeld, a lot of unknown unknowns to our immune response that we're only beginning to appreciate. And that may have been one of the silver linings to the pandemic, is that it made us a little bit more humble in the face of our knowledge in that regard. It certainly made clear how poorly scientists had communicated how the immune system works to the general public. It's and that may very well be due to the word choices of the scientists, the metaphors that we use for the immune system go back to before World War II. It's always a war against the bacteria. or the viruses, but in fact, it's more like a dance than a war. It's not a war that we're ever going to win in that sense.
Nothing will humble you like a infectious disease. That seems to be the takeaway. Incidentally, as we move on, Barbara, your comment about children reminded me of this morning. I was putting my son in his car seat to take him to daycare, and he sneezed the nastiest sneeze on me, just like all over my arm. And I was like, you know what, man? Thanks. Really appreciate that. But that's all it takes, is it's just, you could be as sophisticated and as cautious as you want. All it takes is one kid sneezing on you, and then you got the sore throat. So
those little vectors of disease that we call our children.
Little germ balls, little petri dishes they are. As much as we love them. Okay. All right. So we'll leave that there. Get your flu shot, everyone. Seems like it's going to do you some good this year.
I have to call out and thank him. I mean, I love Henry Miller almost as much as I love your stuff, Chuck. But his last line was brilliant. It doesn't make a difference how effective vaccination is. How effective vaccines are. It's the vaccination that counts. So I thought that was a brilliant line and very well said.
Yes. You have to take the medicine in order for it to have its intended effect. Okay.
Though, as a segue, that brings up the question of whether taking the medicine actually will have an effect.
Yes, that is my previous comment, and Henry's as well, is a precondition on the fact that it actually does indeed work. And it appears that this drug we're talking about here, Sudafed PE, actually doesn't. It's actually apparently worthless, according to our resident chemist, Dr. Josh Bloom. So he says, Sudafed PE is worthless, just like the drug policies that put it on the shelf. So this is from late last month. Josh points out that an FDA panel voted unanimously to withdraw Sudafed PE from the U.S. market. And this is a decongestant. The active ingredient is phenylephrine, I think is how you pronounce that. Someone correct me if I'm mistaken. But the gist of it is, and we'll get into the details in a second, the gist is that pseudoephedrine is the active ingredient in plain old Sudafed that we, consumed uncontroversially for many, many years. But then the DEA got its brilliant bureaucratic ideas going, and they said, we're going to put this behind the pharmacy counter. We're going to limit how much people can buy. And I think it was like you can buy 6 packages a month or something like that. And then the drug companies came up with this alternative called Sudafed PE. And Josh actually says that's a blatant lie because there's not, one drop of Sudafed in this. So you really shouldn't call it that. But in any case, it's my understanding is that it was well known for a long time that this drug did nothing or next to nothing. And anytime I got sick and I went to the pharmacy and I said, hey, I need Sudafed, and they'd go, well, what kind? I was like, the one that works. And they would always giggle because they knew exactly what I was getting at. So your thoughts, let's start with you, Dr. Dinnerstein. What's going on here?
Well, Josh writes in great detail about the fact that the pseudoephedrine, the active form of Sudafed, could be used as a precursor to make methamphetamine. And during the great methamphetamine epidemic, which I believe was after crack, before prescription opioids, somewhere in that war on drugs that we've had, the decision was made via the DEA to make it more difficult to get a hold of Sudafed because kids were buying it up and presumably sending it to Breaking Bad to be made into meth. And as a result, market forces took over because it's more difficult to ask for the drug behind the counter. It takes a few more minutes. It's easier to pick up something on the shelf. And market forces being what they were, because the Sudafed was now more difficult to obtain and therefore its sales were going to drop, the drugs companies came up with Sudafed PE. Now, that was kind of released. I think it made it out there in large part because it had been around for some time and was generally recognized as safe, to use a bureaucratic phase. But certainly it was misrepresented in its labeling, which should have been addressed. But I think, once again, what you see here is what economists call regulatory capture, that the special interests that were involved with the Federal Trade Commission and with the FDA were overly influential in getting another product on the market so that it wouldn't hurt their bottom line.
It's an interesting dynamic when you have, because you have these market forces always at work, but then when you have a government intervene like this, it creates an interesting sort of a, I don't know, like a hybrid situation, if you will. But Barbara, that leads me to my first question for you. I've seen there's already some lawsuits being formed against pharmaceutical companies that make Sudafed and the generic versions. Because they're saying, well, you took this one off the market, or the FDA regulated this one, so you put this junk one on that doesn't do anything, and you still charge people, I don't know, $7 or $8 a package for this, despite knowing it was all but useless. So give me some insight on that. You're the legal scholar of the bunch. Are these lawsuits legitimate? What kind of arguments are they making? Any insight you have, I'd be curious to hear.
Okay, well, very, very good. You are correct. There are lawsuits almost immediately after the FDA's last unanimous resolution that the drug doesn't work. I will go through the history. They recite them in specificities. I found 3 class actions. There was one in New Jersey, one in Minnesota, and one in Florida. I'm sure there will be more pending. The one in New Jersey was filed September 29th. But I think we have to separate out, because it weakens the whole argument about whether Sudafed PE is a viable, effective drug and its relationship with meth. And I think the relationship, or the allegations of the relationship in meth, are specious. There's one paragraph in a 62-page complaint which mentions the relationship. But regardless whether or not the drug was marketed to compensate for the fact that regular Sudafed, good old-fashioned stuff, was not as easily available, it's still an ineffective drug. When you talk about market forces, well, the market forces which made Sudafed harder to get a hold of propelled this drug since its introduction, I believe it was in 2007. And before we get into the specifics of the legalities, I want to ask Chuck a question. There's something very strange here. The drug actually does work if it's topically applied. It doesn't work if it's taken orally, because it takes by the bioavailability of it, by the time it gets to the bloodstream, is less than 1%. But there were studies that said that 50% of people preferred the oral version than the topical version, which does work. And we know, and the reason we have these $1 million cases with hundreds of plaintiffs now and more coming, is because all these people took the drug. Now, if you take the drug once or twice and it doesn't work, so you switch, but people kept taking it. And obviously they kept taking it because they were getting some relief. Now, clearly there's a placebo effect involved, but this drug seemed to have a pretty strong placebo effect. Now, maybe it was due to their incredible marketing, which will come back to haunt them in the lawsuits. But there were market forces driving acceptance of the drug, which I find inexplicable.
Let me throw in a very interesting fun fact about nasal congestion. So congestion is really because the blood vessels have dilated and they're releasing more fluid into the mucosa of the nose. That's what's causing the congestion. That's why phenylephrine applied topically is a vasoconstrictor. It constricts those vessels. It cuts down on the fluid released. This was a fact that I learned many years after medical school, and I've looked back, they really didn't bother to mention it to us, but the blood flow alternates between our left and right nostril. It increases and decreases between the nostrils every 20 minutes. That's physiology. Who knew? But That's our physiology. So if you think about people that have had congestion, it isn't necessarily in both nostrils. And even if it is, our underlying physiology is making one nostril versus the other better or worse over, say, twice an hour. And that very well may be part and parcel why people thought of that as a useful drug.
So that's very interesting and very informative, and that is something that hopefully the plaintiff lawyers will find out about, because they're going to be attacked with that argument. If people are taking it and these drugs are selling, that's because people believe they work. Now, I read a very interesting study a couple of years ago comparing a placebo with some kind of antidepressive and measuring the response on brain PET scans. And the antidepressive was shown to have an objective change in PET scans. And the placebo did also. It just that it affected different versions of the brain. So perhaps positive thinking, or the placebo effect, does have some physical, well, not perhaps, it definitely does have some physical effects. And this one seems to be particularly useful. And so separating out the physiologic from the placebo effects is going to be important. Now, in terms of, Cameron, you asked if the case is valid. There are, in the New Jersey case, there are 7 causes of action, which I'll go through in a minute. But in terms of the association with meth, I reviewed those statistics. It's on the CDC website. And while the new drug was introduced in was reviewed by the FDA in 76, and the spike in meth-associated deaths didn't come until 2014. The spike in many deaths, and you can look at Josh's chart, actually happened between 2010 and 2011. So the introduction of Sudafed PE at best is a correlation and not causation with the meth changes. And certainly the meth attack or the meth influx didn't happen until 2014. Now, the CDC does have that chart that Josh posted up until 2021, and you see the relationship between psychostimulants in combination with synthetic opioids and psychostimulants without opioids. Those lines there shift. And so there's really no correlation, not even a correlation between the meth epidemic and the marketing of this drug. Does that mean that the FDA was mistaken in presuming that making regular Sudafed available would have an impact on the meth epidemic? Well, there wasn't a meth epidemic until several years after introduction of the drug. So there's really no relationship with that. Having said that, this drug is marketed, or was marketed, in a way that doesn't do what it says it's marketed. It doesn't really make a difference if the Sudafed, the regular Sudafed, was behind the counter or the Sudafed PE is easier to access. It makes no difference. And bringing those facts up from a legal standpoint just muddies the waters. And we shouldn't even mention them. First of all, I don't see any relationship with meth, but second of all, it just detracts from the message that even the FDA, even initially in 76, and then later in 2007, and later in 2015, when they reviewed the drug, found no efficacy, or at best questionable efficacy with the drug.
Let me jump ahead for a second and ask, I think the key question, at least from my point of view, when you look at a class action suit, what is the injury?
Okay, so that's a good question. That's an excellent question. It's the same issue we brought up last week when we talked about the Kinder farms, and that is the injury isn't particularly exciting. It's just a couple of dollars. Now, there are claims that there are side effects for the drug. The side effects don't seem to be that particularly exciting. I made a list of what they claimed: anxiety, insomnia, nervousness. There is a claim of high blood pressure, so that could be particularly dangerous. And an allergic reaction is also possible, and that could be real. But unless you have a damage like that, the physical damages are not particularly exciting. When you aggregate them, and in the New Jersey case, this threshold is $5 million. I presume that they're similar in the others. And everybody lost a couple of pennies or even a couple of dollars. It makes money for the lawyers. It's a penalty for the drug companies to have to pay these cases out. And so here's another example that poor Josh is going to have to agree that the plaintiff's attorneys do have a worth in life. Poor Josh. Because they're doing the regulation here. This is an example of the private attorneys general. The regulation, which should have come from the FDA, is being conducted by the plaintiff's bar.
So in the end, these class action suits come down to the fact that they can gather a class together that spent money on Sudafed. I don't know how you would. I don't know who keeps receipts of their Sudafed use, and therefore they wasted money on a worthless product.
Correct. Correct.
So
Correct.
It would seem to me that the members of the class are going to have a tough time proving what their payout should be.
Well, what will happen is they'll arrive at some settlement, and in the administration of the settlement class action, they will decide how much each person gets. Now, in terms of proving it, merely signing an affidavit saying I bought 12 bottles of Sudafed PE is enough to go forward. You can satisfy your burden of going forward. You don't need the receipt. You can just sign an affirmation or sign an affidavit saying you bought it. Now, the other side always has the option of going backwards and saying, no, you didn't, but they have to have some proof that you didn't. So that's not going to happen. Just going forward is really enough. Then the question is going to be, if somebody says, I bought 17 million doses of this stuff, then the other members of the class or the plaintiff's attorney will have to say, I'm sorry, you've got to prove it. But that would be within the class, and they'll just kind of work it out.
So it sounds like in the end, this is a case that's brought before the court only so that it can go to settlement.
Well, they do ask for a jury demand, but most of these class actions in cases like this do settle. Now, there are some intriguing causes of action which could engender punitive damages, and those spike the awards really high. So the 7 claims are breach of express warranty. They said it was effective and it wasn't. Unjust enrichment, which I know you guys like. Negligent misrepresentation. They misrepresented the efficacy of the product. Violation of the Consumer Frauds Act in New Jersey and California. This New Jersey case is brought in New Jersey because the manufacturer supposedly is in New Jersey, but the plaintiff comes from California. They come from all over. And fraud. Fraud brings along with the punitive damage awards. And so that will spike up the award and will, put in quotes, scare the manufacturers into settling, given that they don't really have a response to the fact that the drug doesn't work.
So the labeling and the package insert for all of this stuff is government regulated. They signed off on it. So is there any involvement in the government in bringing a suit against the government?
You can, it's difficult, but you can bring a tort action under the Federal Tort Claims Act. I knew you were going to ask this question, Chuck. I knew it.
I hate to be transparent.
You can bring an action against the government under the Federal Tort Claims Act, but suing the FDA is really very difficult, and there are all sorts of protections involved. And the FDA doesn't come out and say the drug is effective. They say it's safe, and it's reasonably safe. I don't think you can say this is an unsafe drug when you compare it to other drugs. Now, this is really interesting. In 1976, when they evaluated the drug, they used a different methodology. When they evaluated the effectiveness of the drug, they used a different methodology than they do now. And that will, of course, protect them to some extent. They used measures of airflow, objective measures of airflow. And apparently by 2006 and 7, when they reevaluated the effectiveness of the drug, they used a more modern technique, which is clinical symptoms. Now, I don't understand why symptoms, which are a subjective rendition of results, is more advanced than nasal airflow, NAR, which they call it, which is objective, but supposedly, according to the plaintiff's complaint, that's what happened. So initially, I don't think you can fault the FDA because they used an outdated method which showed some effectiveness, not 100%. There were some of the studies, about half of them actually, which showed they weren't, but they made a judgment. Maybe going into their judgment was the fact that we had to give people something and we couldn't give them regular Sudafed, went into their concern. By 2007 and certainly 2015, the data, there were meta-analyses performed, and there were 2 citizens class action suits. And by that time, the FDA should have known, but the FDA is very much afraid of changing their labeling blessings. And so that's an obstacle they have to overcome. Should they have woken up earlier? Probably. But again, you're talking about a relatively safe drug. So this is not going to be number one on their hit parade. I don't think you can find that they were negligent in not getting to this drug when what was the damage involved? The damage was people spent a couple of extra dollars, half of whom thought that the drug helped.
Yes.
You know, this is the cynical side of me speaking, but if I'm a plaintiff's attorney, Barbara, I'm thinking, well, Johnson & Johnson has a lot more money than the FDA or the DEA, and it's easier to sue pharma companies than it is federal regulatory agencies. Therefore, right, it's time to file a lawsuit in 2023. How much does that sort of calculus factor in to the decision to sue now, as opposed to, say, you know, when the drug was first put behind the counter and when some of these studies were done that showed that the active ingredient in Sudafed PE wasn't nearly as useful, at least. Yeah.
I think you should go to law school, Cameron, because your instincts are 99.94% spot on.
I don't know if that's a compliment, by the way.
Well, look, think of the plaintiff's class. The plaintiff's lawyers here are looking out for all of us here. The FDA opinion came out September 12th, and by September 29th, the New Jersey lawsuit was filed. On October 4th, that's 2 days ago, I saw a mention, on September 15th, the Minnesota action was filed. That's 3 days later. So were these cases sitting in the word processor and cobbled together? That's possible. It's not that difficult, but there were a lot of facts in the New Jersey case that they had to assemble. And maybe they were just waiting for this. The citizens class action cases, which were brought, of course, seem to be a precursor for some action by the FDA. So maybe the plaintiff's lawyers were just working on it, but it certainly makes the case a lot easier to pressure or to topple the defendants into settling.
It's interesting stuff.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
I'm looking here while we're chatting. I'm just taking a quick look at some of what's being said. So the Sudafed was approved as an over-the-counter drug. And to quote, over-the-counter drugs, for most over-the-counter drugs are not reviewed or approved by the FDA. However, they may be marketed if they comply with applicable regulations and standards. The FDA has not evaluated whether this product complies with even with the marketing. So this was just something that they released out into the general public.
So it sounds to me like a pretty good disclaimer that would protect the FDA. I don't see that the FDA is going to have a problem here. I think the problem that we as a country has is there seems to be an influx of of products that are being hyped beyond acceptability. We talked about the Kinder Farms last week. I just saw a case of a weight loss drug. I just saw fish oil, literally a fish oil drug, that are improperly marketed. So there seems to be an influx of improperly marketed drugs. And if the FDA is not going to regulate them, which they aren't paying attention to, then it's up to the plaintiff's attorneys to keep these manufacturers on the straight and narrow, as well as caveat emptor. You know, we used to think that the buyer beware doctrine is out the window. It's not, clearly.
A truly alarming fact that you learn as you grow up in this world, that people don't always have your best interests at heart.
Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing, as they say in California.
Yeah, we care about people's feelings and opinions here on the very strange left coast. All right. Thank you both for joining me as always. Very insightful conversations. I hope people get something out of this podcast, because I sure do every time. It's just great to talk with smart people. It's good for your brain. We're going to leave it there for the week. We'll be back same time next week. Until then, follow us on social media. The organization is at ACSH.org. I am at CamJ English. You can go to acsh.org to find out more about my beloved colleagues here and the work that they do, and read all their stuff. It's really, really good. You'll learn a lot. And with that, we're out of here. See you next time.
Thanks a lot, Cameron. See you guys next time.